All right, buddy. Time to move out. Good boy. Let's go. It's a long road, hasn't it, boy? We made it through together. Good boy, Navi. You always know. All right, let's get moving. We have a long way to go.
They laughed when a disgraced Navy SEAL was driven from his family land, until his German Shepherd dug something out of a ruined cellar that exposed a lie buried for 30 years. After losing his home, his reputation, and his own son's respect, Jax Harlan had nothing left but an old iron key his grandmother once entrusted to him, and a fiercely loyal German Shepherd named Smoky. When he finally unsealed the forgotten basement beneath her burned-down estate, Smoky began tearing into the damp earth, and what they unearthed would force an entire city to face a devastating truth. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The morning sun rose over Blackwood Ridge like a pale and uncaring eye, casting long, jagged shadows across the dense Colorado pines and the wide, frost-covered fields. The wind moved slowly through the valley, carrying the bitter chill of early autumn, brushing against the rough bark of the trees with a sound like a tired, drawn-out breath. The mountains stood towering and silent in the distance, vast monuments of gray stone and white snow beneath a cloudless, endless sky. By all accounts, it should have been a quiet, peaceful morning in the high country. But for Jax Harlan, it was the morning his world finally and completely collapsed. A heavy, rusted pickup truck sat idling unevenly in the gravel driveway of the weathered wooden house where Jax had lived for the better part of his life. The bed of the truck was loaded with the sparse, broken remnants of a man who had been slowly losing pieces of himself for decades. There were stacked cardboard boxes secured with frayed rope, a canvas duffel bag containing old military gear, a few worn wool blankets, a collection of woodworking tools, and a faded leather photo album. Everything else inside the small, fading house had already been claimed, sold, or taken away. Two men representing the county bank stood near the leaning wooden steps of the front porch. They held leather-bound clipboards against their chests, their postures rigid and uncomfortable in their dark, neatly pressed suits. They spoke in hushed, hurried tones, completely avoiding looking directly at the man standing just a few feet away from them. Jax Harlan stood perfectly still beside the edge of the driveway, his broad shoulders slightly hunched beneath a heavy, faded canvas jacket. At 52 years old, the former Navy SEAL looked as though he had lived a dozen lifetimes, none of them easy. Deep, rugged lines were carved across his weathered face, etching a permanent map of exhaustion into his features. These were not the gentle lines of natural aging. They were the harsh, unforgiving marks of endless desert suns, of violent nights spent in places the rest of the world chose to ignore, and of an agonizing, invisible war that had followed him back home. His eyes, a pale and storm-swept gray, stared blankly at the peeling white paint of the house. Beside him, standing with the quiet, imposing dignity of a born protector, was Smoky. The massive German Shepherd possessed a thick, rich coat of dark sable and burnt tan that rippled slightly in the biting mountain wind. Smoky was not merely a companion to the broken man beside him. He was a lifeline, a grounded anchor in a world that constantly threatened to pull Jax beneath the waves of his own traumatic memories. Smoky watched the bankmen with sharp, intelligent amber eyes, his large ears swiveled forward, capturing every restless shuffle of their shoes on the gravel. He pressed his heavy, warm side firmly against Jax's leg, offering a silent, unyielding declaration of solidarity. Where the man went, the dog would follow. The heavy wooden front door groaned on its rusted hinges as it was pushed open from the inside. Mayor Harlan stepped out onto the porch, pulling the collar of his jacket tight against the cold. There was a time, many years ago, when Matteo had looked at his father as if Jax were a giant, an invincible hero who could conquer any storm. Now, Mateo simply looked through him, his eyes carrying the heavy, exhausting burden of a son who had spent too many years watching his father fall apart. "We are completely finished here," Mateo said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth as he addressed the men from the bank. The older of the two bank officials gave a quick, almost relieved nod. "The final paperwork has been processed and filed with the county. The property transfer takes effect at noon today. We will lock the doors behind us." Jax remained entirely silent. He did not turn his head to acknowledge the men, nor did he look at his son. His gaze was fixed on the lowest step of the porch. The wood was rotting now, splintering under the weight of neglected years, but Jax could still remember a time when his grandmother, Eleanor Harlan, had knelt in the soft dirt beside that very step, her hands gently pressing the roots of bright purple columbines into the soil while she hummed a soft, melodic tune. Those flowers had died a long time ago, suffocated by the weeds and the slow decay of a life that had spiraled out of control. Mateo descended the stairs, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He paused a few feet away from Jax, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Dad, it is done. The bank sold the land. I told you months ago that I could not stop this from happening." Jax finally turned his head. His voice, when it broke the silence, was remarkably low, carrying a rough, gravelly weight that sounded like stones grinding together beneath a river. "You did not even try to stop them." Mateo let out a long, ragged exhale, crossing his arms over his chest as if trying to shield himself from the cold reality of the moment. "How was I supposed to try? You have not held down a steady job in years. Between the medical bills, the endless property taxes, and the debts you refused to let me help you with, this was only a matter of time. You let this happen?" Jax slowly nodded, accepting the harsh judgment without offering a defense. He could not explain it to Mateo because he barely understood it himself. Years ago, Jax had returned from his final devastating deployment in the Middle East, carrying a chest full of medals for extreme valor and a mind fractured by unspeakable loss. The daylight hours were difficult, but the nights were an absolute torment. In the dark, the quiet Colorado mountains vanished, replaced by the deafening, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors chopping through thick desert heat. He still tasted the choking sand in his throat. He still heard the chaotic, terrifying echoes of collapsing concrete bunkers and the screams of men he could not save. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the military doctors had called it, handing him a plastic bottle of pills before sending him out the door, but the town of Blackwood Ridge called it something else. They called him a liability, a risk, and eventually, after the terrible scandal that Mayor Silas Vance had so carefully wrapped around Jax's neck, they called him a thief. Smoky leaned harder against Jax's leg, a soft, vibrating whine vibrating in his deep chest. The German Shepherd could smell the sharp, acidic scent of adrenaline and sorrow radiating from his handler. Smoky bumped his wet nose against Jax's palm, pulling the veteran back from the edge of the memory. Jax instinctively opened his hand, letting his rough fingers bury themselves in the thick fur behind the dog's ears. Mateo glanced down at the dog, his expression softening for only a fraction of a second before hardening again. "You need to take the dog and leave," he said, his tone clipped. "But Dad, you cannot stay anywhere near Blackwood Ridge. There is nothing left for you here. People do not want you around." The words hung suspended in the freezing morning air, sharp and jagged like broken glass. Jax studied the face of the young man standing before him. He searched desperately for the little boy who used to run through the tall summer grass with a wooden rifle, proudly declaring to anyone who would listen that he was going to be a brave soldier just like his father. That innocent, adoring boy was gone, replaced by a bitter man who had chosen to believe the lies of a corrupt town over the honor of his own flesh and blood. "There is a specialized veteran housing facility down in Denver," Mateo continued, his voice dropping slightly, laced with a mixture of pity and frustration. "I made a few calls. They have open beds. They have doctors who know how to handle people with your specific issues. They can help you figure things out. Jax slowly shook his head, his jaw setting into a rigid line. I'm not going to Denver. I do not need a facility. Mateo threw his hands up in a gesture of utter defeat. Then where exactly are you going to go? You have no money. You have no house. And you have a massive dog to feed. Jax did not answer the question. The absolute, unvarnished truth was that he had absolutely no idea where the road would take him. He only knew that he could not surrender. A Navy SEAL did not simply lie down and wait for the end. Even when the entire world had turned its back on him, the bank officials climbed into their sleek, dark sedan, the engine purring smoothly as they reversed out of the driveway. Their tires kicked up a cloud of pale dust that drifted slowly across the barren, neglected front yard. Mateo checked the silver watch on his wrist, his jaw tight. I have to get back to the city for work. He hesitated, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a thick, white envelope and stepped forward, placing it carefully on top of one of the cardboard boxes sitting in the bed of the rusted truck. There is $1,000 in cash inside that envelope. Use it for gas. Use it for food. Just use it to get out of the valley. Jax looked at the stark white envelope resting against the worn cardboard, but he made no move to reach for it. He simply let it sit there. Without waiting for a goodbye, Mateo turned on his heel and walked briskly to his own car. The engine fired up, and within moments, the vehicle was accelerating down the gravel road, shrinking rapidly until it disappeared completely around a sharp bend of towering pine trees. The valley plunged back into a deep, hollow silence. Only the mournful howling of the wind remained, sweeping across the empty fields. Jax stood absolutely motionless for a long, heavy span of time. Smoky sat beside him, mirroring his stillness, a loyal guard refusing to abandon his post. Finally, Jax reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the worn leather photo album from the back of the truck. The leather was cracked, dry from years of neglect. He opened the cover slowly. Inside, resting against the yellowing pages, were the frozen remnants of a beautiful, stolen life. There was a picture of Eleanor Harlan, her kind, wrinkled face smiling warmly as she stood in her lush garden. There was a photo of a much younger, stronger Jax, standing tall and proud in his pristine Navy dress uniform. And there was a snapshot of little Mateo, sitting high and happy on Jax's broad shoulders during a summer festival in the town square. Jax closed the heavy album. The leather felt cold beneath his fingertips. For a terrifying, suffocating second, the edges of his vision began to darken. The familiar, paralyzing grip of a panic attack began to squeeze his chest. He heard the faint, distant crack of sniper fire echoing through his mind. The smell of burning diesel fuel filled his nose, but before the darkness could pull him under, a heavy paw scratched urgently at his knee. Jax blinked rapidly, forcing his eyes to focus. The majestic mountains of Colorado slowly materialized out of the fog of his memory. Smoky was standing on his hind legs, resting his massive front paws squarely against Jax's chest, forcing the man to bear his weight. The dog let out a sharp, demanding bark, breaking the invisible spell of the trauma. Jax let out a long, shuddering breath. He wrapped his arms around the thick neck of the German Shepherd, burying his face in the coarse, warm fur. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "It looks like it is just the two of us now against the rest of the world." Smoky dropped back down to all fours, his tail wagging in a slow, steady rhythm. Jax walked slowly around the front of the rusted pickup truck and pulled open the heavy metal door. He climbed into the driver's seat, the old springs groaning under his weight. Smoky leapt effortlessly into the passenger side, sitting tall and alert as he looked out through the scratched windshield. Jax turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed violently, choked, and then finally roared to life, shaking the entire frame of the vehicle. The fuel gauge needle barely rested above the empty line. Jax shifted the truck into drive and pressed his foot against the pedal. The tires crunched loudly against the gravel as he steered the vehicle slowly down the long road, driving away from the only home he had ever known, leaving behind the shattered pieces of his life in the dust. The road leading away from the town of Blackwood Ridge was a treacherous, neglected ribbon of cracked asphalt that slowly surrendered to loose dirt and jagged gravel the higher it climbed into the towering mountains. The rusted pickup truck groaned and rattled in furious protest with every steep incline, its worn suspension complaining loudly as the vehicle navigated the deep ruts and washed out sections of the forgotten mountain pass. Jax Harlan gripped the cracked leather of the steering wheel with hands that were rough, calloused, and numb from the biting cold that seeped through the poorly sealed windows. He drove in absolute silence, his pale gray eyes fixed blankly on the winding path ahead, though his mind was entirely disconnected from the physical act of driving. He was a man adrift, unmoored from the world of the living, floating helplessly in the vast, empty space between the life he had just been forced to abandon and a future that simply did not exist. Beside him, Smoky sat with perfect, unwavering posture in the passenger seat. The massive German Shepherd watched the dense barricade of pine trees blur past the scratched glass of the window, his sharp amber eyes tracking the fleeting shadows of birds and the sudden darting movements of unseen wildlife deep within the timber. Even within the confined, vibrating cab of the dying truck, Smoky maintained an aura of intense, protective vigilance. He was not merely riding, he was actively guarding the fractured man beside him. Every few minutes, the heavy dog would shift his weight, leaning closer to the center console to press his warm, wet nose against Jax's rigid forearm, a gentle, tactile reminder that Jax was not navigating this desolate wilderness alone. Jax would respond with a slow, mechanical movement, reaching over to rub the thick, coarse fur along the back of the dog's neck, drawing a small measure of warmth from the only creature on earth who still looked at him with absolute, unwavering respect. They drove for nearly an hour, climbing higher into the unforgiving altitude of the Colorado wilderness. The air grew perceptibly thinner, and the dense canopy of ancient towering pines began to block out the pale morning sun, casting the winding road into a deep, perpetual twilight. The temperature dropped sharply, chilling the metal interior of the cab. Suddenly, the engine of the old pickup gave a violent, shuddering cough. The truck lurched forward violently, throwing Jax against his seatbelt. The engine sputtered, gasped for fuel that was no longer there, and then died completely with a hollow metallic clank. The heavy steering wheel locked up in Jax's hands, and the vehicle coasted for a few agonizingly slow yards before rolling to a dead, heavy stop near the crumbling edge of a steep, rocky embankment. The silence that instantly swallowed the cab was absolute and profound. There was no sound of passing traffic, no distant hum of civilization, only the mournful, high-pitched whistling of the mountain wind tearing through the jagged branches of the pines. Jax did not strike the steering wheel in frustration. He did not curse his luck or scream into the void. He simply leaned his head back against the worn fabric of the headrest and closed his eyes, releasing a long, slow breath that plumed into a white cloud of vapor in the freezing air. It was a quiet, crushing resignation. The universe had taken his home, his reputation, and his son. It only made sense that it would take his last means of transportation as well. "Well, buddy," Jax murmured, his gravelly voice barely louder than the wind outside. "I suppose this is where the ride ends." Smoky let out a short, affirmative huff, already turning his large body to face the passenger door, his ears pricked forward in anticipation of the next command. Jax pushed open his heavy metal door and stepped out onto the frozen, uneven gravel. The cold mountain air hit his lungs like shattered glass, sharp and deeply punishing, but it was a pain he welcomed. It was a physical sensation that demanded his immediate attention, pulling his mind away from the suffocating despair of the morning. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door, stepping back to allow Smoky to leap effortlessly from the cab. The massive dog landed with a soft, practiced grace, his heavy paws crunching lightly on the frost-covered stones. Smoky immediately lowered his nose to the ground, aggressively taking in the thousands of complex scents layered within the wild, untamed environment, mapping the invisible terrain of the forest. Jax reached into the bed of the dead truck and grabbed his heavy, faded green canvas duffel bag. It contained the absolute bare minimum required for basic survival: a thick wool blanket from his military days, a steel canteen, a heavy utility knife, a flashlight, and a small metal tin holding the antique iron key his grandmother Eleanor had pressed into his hand decades ago. He hoisted the heavy bag over his broad shoulders, the worn canvas strap digging sharply into his collarbone. He did not look back at the truck. He did not look back toward the distant, hidden town of Blackwood Ridge. He simply turned his face toward the imposing, heavily forested ridge that loomed like a dark, jagged fortress in the distance. Beyond that treacherous ridge lay the forgotten, burned-down ruins of Eleanor Harlan's estate. It was a plot of land the rest of the county had deemed utterly worthless. A scarred patch of earth swallowed by decades of overgrown weeds and creeping vines. But before she had passed away, Eleanor had looked at a much younger, much stronger Jax with deep, knowing eyes, pressing the cold iron key into his palm. She had told him, with a voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty, that if the world ever successfully stripped him of everything he loved, he must return to the old cellar beneath the ruins. He had not understood her warning then. He barely understood it now. But with nothing left to lose, the ghost of his grandmother's promise was the only compass he had left. "Let us move out, Smoky," Jax commanded quietly. The German Shepherd instantly abandoned his investigation of the roadside bushes and took the lead, his muscular frame pushing forward into the dense, dark tree line. Jax followed close behind, his heavy leather boots breaking through the brittle crust of frozen pine needles and snapping dead branches that had fallen during previous winter storms. The hike began as a slow, methodical climb. The terrain was brutal and unforgiving, characterized by steep, treacherous inclines, loose, sliding shale, and massive, rotting logs that blocked the narrow, deer-worn paths. For the first mile, Jax's body remembered the supreme physical conditioning of a Navy SEAL. His breathing fell into a steady, controlled rhythm, pulling the thin, freezing oxygen deep into his lungs. His legs, though older and scarred by shrapnel, moved with deliberate, practiced efficiency, finding secure footholds among the treacherous rocks. But as the elevation continued to climb and the air grew increasingly thin, the grueling reality of his 52 years and his deteriorating physical health began to exact a heavy toll. His chest began to heave with exertion, a dull, throbbing ache radiating outward from his knees and his lower back. Smoky seemed to sense the subtle shift in his handler's physical state. The intelligent dog deliberately slowed his relentless pace, looking back over his shoulder every few yards to ensure Jax was maintaining contact. Whenever the incline became particularly brutal, Smoky would pause entirely, waiting patiently like a silent, furry sentinel until Jax closed the distance, before continuing the arduous climb. They moved together not just as a man and a dog, but as a deeply bonded, highly functional unit, communicating through silent glances and the shared rhythm of their exhaustive march. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple and burnt orange, the physical exhaustion began to systematically break down the mental walls Jax used to keep his darkest memories contained. The rhythmic crunching of his boots on the rocky soil slowly began to morph in his mind. The sound shifted from the breaking of Colorado pine needles to the dry, gritty crunch of heavy combat boots marching through the unforgiving, sun-blasted sands of a Middle Eastern desert. The temperature around him was freezing, yet Jax suddenly felt a suffocating, unbearable wave of blistering heat radiating against his face. The dark, towering pine trees surrounding him began to shimmer and distort, melting away into the crumbling, bullet-pocked concrete walls of an abandoned, war-torn city. The mountain wind whistling past his ears transformed into the chaotic, terrifying shrieks of incoming mortar fire. Jax stumbled forward, his heavy boot catching violently on an exposed, twisting root. He fell hard to his knees, the canvas duffel bag slamming heavily against his back, driving the remaining air out of his lungs. He gasped desperately, but his throat felt entirely coated in thick, choking desert dust. His wide, terrified eyes stared at the dark soil of the mountain, but all he saw was the bright, blinding crimson of blood pooling rapidly in the sand beside him. He heard the screaming voices of his squad mates, calling out names of men who were already gone. He reached out blindly with a trembling hand, trying to grab the strap of a rifle that was not there, his chest convulsing in the grip of an intense, paralyzing panic attack. The past had reached out and pulled him violently beneath the surface, drowning him in the horrors of a war he could never truly leave behind. Suddenly, a massive, solid weight slammed heavily against his chest, knocking him completely backward onto the cold mountain earth. A rough, wet tongue dragged forcefully across his cheek. A deep, powerful whine, followed by a sharp, commanding bark, shattered the deafening echoes of the mortar fire in his mind. Jax gasped, his eyes flying open to see Smoky standing directly over him. The massive German Shepherd had his heavy front paws planted firmly on either side of Jax's shoulders, his face inches away, completely blocking out the sky. Smoky stared down into Jax's terrified eyes with fierce, unyielding intensity, his deep chest rumbling with a powerful, grounding vibration. The dog refused to move, refused to allow the invisible demons to drag his handler back into the darkness. Smoky deliberately pressed his heavy, warm body weight down onto Jax, utilizing a pressure therapy technique he had instinctively mastered over the years, forcing Jax's erratic, panicked nervous system to acknowledge the physical reality of the present moment. Jax lay on the freezing ground, his chest heaving violently as he stared up into the beautiful, amber eyes of the animal that was currently saving his life. He focused entirely on the coarse texture of the dog's fur brushing against his chin, the smell of damp earth and pine resin clinging to Smoky's coat, and the steady, reassuring warmth radiating from the dog's muscular body. Slowly, agonizingly, the phantom desert heat began to recede. The crumbling concrete walls dissolved back into the sturdy trunks of the Colorado pines. The screaming voices faded, replaced once again by the gentle, mournful rustling of the mountain wind. Jax squeezed his eyes shut, a single, hot tear escaping and tracking a clean line through the dirt on his weathered face. He reached up with shaking, exhausted hands and grabbed handfuls of Smoky's thick fur, burying his face in the side of the dog's warm neck. "I'm here," Jax whispered, his voice broken and raw, fighting through the lingering terror of the flashback. "I'm right here, Smoky. I'm back. You got me. You always get me." Smoky let out a soft, satisfied huff, his tail wagging slowly, brushing against the dead leaves on the ground. The dog held his position for another long minute, ensuring the panic had fully subsided, before slowly stepping back to allow the veteran to sit up. Jax pushed himself up from the dirt with aching, trembling arms. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his canvas sleeve, taking several long, deliberate breaths of the freezing mountain air to fully clear the lingering ghosts from his mind. He looked at the heavy duffel bag lying in the dirt, the symbol of everything he had left, and then he looked at the powerful, loyal animal standing patiently beside him. He was deeply broken, battered by the world and haunted by his own mind. But as long as Smoky was by his side, he was not defeated. "Let us finish the hike, buddy," Jax said, his voice finding a small, hardened edge of its former command. "We are almost there." They pushed forward, breaking through the final, dense thicket of the mountain path, just as the last dying rays of daylight bled out from the sky. They emerged onto a wide, sweeping ridge that overlooked a secluded, bowl-shaped valley. Jax stopped, his chest heaving, and looked down. There, resting silently in the center of the forgotten valley floor, completely overgrown with aggressive, twisting vines and choked by decades of wild, untamed grass, were the blackened, Stone foundation ruins of Eleanor Harlan's estate. The roof was completely gone, having collapsed in the fire 30 years ago, and the wooden walls had long since surrendered to the brutal elements. It looked like the skeletal remains of a forgotten world, a place completely erased from the memory of Blackwood Ridge. But as Jax looked down into the darkening valley, staring at the charred stones that held the only mystery he had left to solve, he felt a strange, deep pull in his gut. He reached his hand into his heavy jacket pocket, his fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, heavy iron key. He did not know what was waiting for him down there in the freezing darkness, but he knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that his grandmother had not sent him here simply to die. Smoky bumped his head against Jax's thigh, his ears swiveled forward, staring intensely down at the ruins below. Jax nodded, adjusting the heavy strap of the canvas bag on his aching shoulder. "Let us go see what Eleanor left us, Smoky." They began the final, treacherous descent into the valley, stepping off the ridge and walking slowly downward into the gathering darkness, moving step by step closer toward a truth that had been patiently waiting for 30 years to finally be unearthed. The descent into the forgotten valley was a slow, agonizing surrender to the encroaching night. Every heavy step Jax took sent a shockwave of dull, throbbing pain up through his battered knees, but he forced himself to maintain the steady, rhythmic pace he had learned a lifetime ago. The air within the bowl of the valley felt remarkably different from the biting, thin wind on the mountain ridge. It was heavier here, dense with the thick, intoxicating scent of decaying pine needles, damp earth, and the ancient, lingering memory of charred wood. The towering Colorado pines grew closer together in this hidden depression, their massive, interwoven branches creating a nearly impenetrable canopy that aggressively choked out the last remaining streaks of purple twilight. As they approached the center of the valley floor, the skeletal remains of Eleanor Harlan's estate slowly materialized out of the gloom like a sunken ship rising from the depths of a dark ocean. The sprawling multi-story wooden house that Jax remembered from his distant childhood was completely gone, utterly consumed by a devastating fire 3 decades earlier. In its place remained only the massive blackened stones of the original foundation and the towering soot-stained bricks of the central hearth, which stood defiantly against the sky like a solitary crumbling monument to a forgotten era. Nature had spent the last 30 years aggressively reclaiming the land. Thick, creeping vines with thorny stems had wrapped themselves tightly around the charred stones, pulling them slowly back into the earth, while tall, aggressive weeds choked the spaces where a meticulously manicured porch had once stood. Smoky moved cautiously through the tall, frost-covered grass, his massive head lowered, his sharp nose pulling in the complex layers of scents that had settled over the ruins. The German Shepherd navigated the broken terrain with absolute silent precision, his ears swiveling constantly like radar dishes, mapping the perimeter to ensure no hidden predators were lurking in the shadows of the collapsed stones. Jax followed closely behind, dropping his heavy canvas duffel bag onto a relatively flat patch of moss-covered ground. He stood before the crumbling brick fireplace, reaching out with a trembling, calloused hand to touch the rough, cold stone. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing the fragmented memories of his childhood to wash over him. He could almost hear the crackle of burning oak, smell the sweet aroma of Eleanor's cinnamon bread baking in the cast-iron stove, and feel the profound, unconditional safety that this house had once provided before the world tore everything away. But the brief moment of nostalgic peace was violently shattered by a sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The Colorado mountains were notoriously unforgiving, capable of birthing violent, destructive weather systems with almost zero warning. A sudden, massive drop in atmospheric pressure caused the hairs on the back of Jax's neck to stand completely on end. The gentle, mournful wind that had accompanied their hike abruptly died, replaced by a suffocating, dead calm that felt heavy and incredibly unnatural. A few seconds later, a low, ominous rumble echoed off the surrounding mountain peaks, vibrating through the soles of Jax's boots. He looked up through the gaps in the pine canopy. The stars that had just begun to show themselves were instantly swallowed by a rapidly advancing wall of thick, bruised, charcoal-colored storm clouds rolling violently over the northern ridge. The temperature plummeted immediately. The distinct, metallic scent of ozone and impending rain flooded the valley. "We need to find the cellar," Jax ordered, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the heavy silence with the trained urgency of a seasoned combat veteran. "Find it, Smoky. Seek." The German Shepherd instantly understood the command and the shifting stakes. Smoky abandoned his perimeter patrol and began a rapid, frantic search of the interior foundation, his nose pressed firmly against the dirt and broken stone. Jax pulled the heavy, metallic flashlight from his canvas bag and flicked it on, sweeping the powerful, blinding beam of white light across the overgrown ruins. The first massive, heavy drops of freezing rain began to fall, striking the broad leaves of the creeping vines with sharp, percussive slaps. They moved together through the debris, desperately tearing away thick layers of dead vegetation and kicking aside heavy, rotting planks of wood. The thunder cracked again, much louder this time, a deafening explosion of sound that made the ground tremble. The rain intensified, transforming instantly from scattered drops into a blinding, freezing deluge that soaked through Jax's heavy canvas jacket within seconds. "Here," Jax shouted, dropping to his knees near the rear corner of the foundation. His flashlight beam had illuminated a thick, unnatural mound of earth and thorny vines. He set the light down on a nearby stone and began tearing at the aggressive vegetation with his bare, calloused hands, ignoring the sharp thorns that sliced deeply into his palms. Beneath the thick layer of rot and dirt, his fingers scraped against solid, cold metal. He dug faster, panting heavily, his muscles burning with exertion as the freezing rain pounded relentlessly against his back. Slowly, agonizingly, the shape of two heavy, rusted iron doors emerged from the earth. They were set flush against the ground, secured in the center by a massive, ancient iron padlock that looked as though it had not been touched in 30 years. Jax wiped the freezing rain and mud from his eyes and reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out the heavy iron key his grandmother had given him. He jammed the key into the rusted keyhole of the padlock. It did not want to turn. Decades of corrosion and buried moisture fought against the mechanism. Jax gritted his teeth, wrapping both of his bleeding hands around the base of the key, and forced it with every ounce of physical strength he had left. With a loud, agonizing metallic snap, the internal tumblers broke free. The heavy padlock popped open. Jax ripped the lock away and tossed it into the mud. He grabbed the rusted iron ring of the right side door and pulled upward with a violent, desperate heave. The heavy hinges screamed in protest, a terrible, grinding shriek of metal on metal, but the doors slowly gave way, opening to reveal a square pit of absolute, pitch-black darkness. A wave of stale, freezing air rushed up from the earth, smelling powerfully of damp stone and undisturbed time. Smoky did not hesitate. The brave dog immediately bounded down the steep, stone steps into the darkness, his thick coat heavy with the freezing rain. Jax grabbed his duffel bag and his flashlight, swinging his legs over the edge and hurrying down the narrow, treacherous stone stairs just as a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the entire valley, immediately followed by a world-shattering crack of thunder. Jax reached up and grabbed the iron handle from the inside, pulling the heavy cellar door shut over his head with a resounding clang, instantly sealing them off from the raging storm above. The sudden silence inside the cellar was deeply disorienting. The violent, chaotic roar of the wind and the pounding rain were immediately muffled by the thick layer of earth and stone above their heads, reduced to a low, distant, rhythmic thumping. Jax stood at the bottom of the stairs, breathing heavily, the freezing rainwater dripping steadily from his hair and his soaked jacket, pooling darkly on the hard-packed dirt floor. He raised the flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the forgotten space. The cellar was surprisingly large, constructed with thick, precisely cut blocks of mountain granite that had completely withstood the fire and the passage of time. Heavy wooden support beams ran across the low ceiling, holding back the immense weight of the earth above. The space was completely empty, save for a few rotting wooden crates pushed against the far wall and a thick, undisturbed carpet of gray dust that covered every surface. Jax let out a long, shuddering exhale, the adrenaline slowly beginning to drain from his exhausted muscles. "We made it, buddy," he whispered, moving to drop his heavy canvas bag against the stone wall. "We are out of the storm." But as Jax spoke the words, the storm above them unleashed its true fury. A massive, sustained roll of thunder detonated directly over the valley. The sheer acoustic force of the strike bypassed the heavy earth and vibrated violently through the solid granite walls of the cellar. The ground beneath Jax's boots physically shook. Dust rained down from the wooden ceiling beams, catching the beam of the flashlight in a swirling, chaotic cloud. In that exact, terrifying fraction of a second, the heavy, enclosing stone walls of the cellar ceased to be a safe haven. To Jax's fractured, traumatized mind, the damp, dark basement instantly transformed into the crumbling, suffocating confines of a subterranean combat bunker in the middle of a war zone. The flashlight slipped from his numb, trembling fingers, hitting the dirt floor with a dull thud and rolling away, casting crazy, spinning shadows across the walls. Jax slammed his back against the cold granite, his hands flying up to grip the sides of his head. He could not breathe. The air in the cellar felt exactly like the thick, choking concrete dust of a collapsed roof. The muffled thumping of the rain against the cellar doors transformed into the terrifying, rhythmic thud of incoming artillery shells marching methodically toward his position. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the darkness behind his eyelids was filled with the blinding flashes of muzzle fire and the chaotic, desperate screaming of his trapped squad mates. He slid slowly down the rough stone wall, his knees buckling completely beneath him until he was curled into a tight, defensive ball on the dirt floor. He was gasping violently, his chest convulsing as he tried to pull oxygen into lungs that refused to expand. He was no longer a 52-year-old man hiding from a Colorado storm. He was a trapped soldier, waiting in the suffocating darkness for the final, devastating explosion that would bury him forever. The panic was absolute, a completely paralyzing terror that gripped his heart with hands of ice. But down here in the dark, beneath the earth, he was not alone. Smoky sensed the catastrophic shift in his handler's psychological state the exact moment the flashlight hit the floor. The dog did not cower from the thunder, nor did he shrink away from the violent, erratic movements of the terrified man. Instead, the massive German Shepherd moved with the precise, deliberate focus of a highly trained medical lifeline. Smoky stepped directly into the space between Jax and the crushing, imaginary walls. He let out a sharp, incredibly loud bark that echoed violently off the stone, a sound specifically designed to cut through the auditory hallucinations of the combat zone. Then, Smoky closed the distance completely. The dog forced his large, heavy head under Jax's trembling arms, violently breaking the defensive posture Jax had curled himself into. Jax tried to pull away, trapped in the hallucination, but Smoky was relentless. The dog threw his entire 90-pound weight forcefully across Jax's chest and lap, pinning the man to the dirt floor. Smoky began aggressively licking the cold, sweat-drenched skin of Jax's face and neck, providing an overwhelming flood of sensory input that demanded the human brain process the immediate, physical present rather than the traumatic past. Smoky's deep chest vibrated with a powerful, sustained, resonant hum, a grounding frequency that slowly began to counteract the violent, panicked rhythm of Jax's failing heart. The heavy, suffocating concrete dust of the hallucination slowly began to dissolve, replaced by the sharp, undeniable scent of a wet dog and damp mountain earth. The phantom screams faded into the steady, rhythmic panting of the animal lying heavily across his chest. Jax's erratic gasping slowly transitioned into ragged, hitching sobs. He wrapped his arms fiercely around Smoky's broad back, burying his face into the thick, wet fur of the dog's neck, holding on to the animal as if Smoky were the only solid object left in a disintegrating universe. They stayed locked together on the freezing dirt floor for a very long time, while the storm raged completely ignored above them. Eventually, the violent shaking in Jax's limbs began to subside. His breathing slowed, matching the calm, steady rhythm of the dog protecting him. The cellar returned to being just a cellar, cold, dark, and smelling of the past. Jax slowly opened his eyes. He reached out with a weak, trembling hand and grabbed the flashlight from where it had rolled, shining the beam weakly across the stone floor. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his voice nothing more than a ragged whisper. "Good boy. The best boy. Thank you." Smoky lifted his head, his ears swiveling forward, but he did not look at Jax. The dog's intelligent amber eyes were locked intensely on a specific, unremarkable patch of dirt near the center of the cellar floor. Jax slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, wiping the mixture of sweat and rain from his exhausted face. He followed the dog's gaze with the beam of the flashlight. "What is it?" "Smoky." Smoky stood up, his posture entirely changed. He was no longer the comforting healer. He was highly alert, his tail held straight, the fur along his spine raised slightly. The dog took 3 deliberate steps toward the center of the room, lowered his nose directly to the dirt, took a deep, analyzing breath, and then began to dig with furious, unrelenting purpose. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the rain against the thick wooden cellar doors slowly began to fade, transitioning from a violent, deafening roar into a soft, steady, exhausted patter. The fierce mountain storm that had sought to tear the valley apart was finally breaking, its terrifying energy spent, rolling away over the jagged northern peaks and leaving behind a profound, heavy silence in its wake. Down in the absolute darkness of the subterranean cellar, the air felt thick and entirely disconnected from the world above. The only source of illumination was the single, powerful beam of Jax's heavy metallic flashlight, which lay sideways on the packed dirt floor, casting a sharp, elongated circle of brilliant white light against the rough, granite stones of the far wall. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam, looking like tiny floating stars suspended in a forgotten universe. Smoky did not stop to rest. The massive German Shepherd was entirely consumed by a fierce, instinctual focus. His powerful front paws tore into the compacted, frozen earth near the center of the room with a frantic, unrelenting rhythm. Dirt and small stones flew backward through the air, scattering across the cellar floor as the dog dug deeper into the ground. His breathing was heavy and sharp, occasionally punctuated by a loud, forceful snort as he cleared the dust from his sensitive nasal passages. He was not digging blindly. His actions were incredibly deliberate, guided by an invisible scent trail that only he could perceive. Buried beneath decades of undisturbed Colorado soil, Jax sat quietly on the cold dirt a few feet away, his back still resting against the granite wall. He watched the dog work, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady cadence as the last, lingering traces of the panic attack finally evaporated from his bloodstream. His limbs felt incredibly heavy, drained of all adrenaline, but his mind was crystal clear for the first time since the bank officials had driven him from his land that morning. He watched Smoky's powerful shoulders bunch and release with every strike at the earth. In all the years they had been together, through the brutal transitions back to civilian life, Smoky had never displayed this specific type of frantic behavior. The dog was trained to detect explosives, to track lost individuals through miles of wilderness, and to sense the invisible shifts in human brain chemistry. He did not dig holes simply for the sake of digging. He had found something. Jax pushed himself up from the ground, his stiff joints popping in protest. He walked slowly over to the far corner of the cellar, sweeping the flashlight beam across the pile of rotting wooden crates and discarded debris. leaning against the damp stone wall, half buried behind a collapsed stack of firewood. He spotted the dull, rusted metal edge of an old, heavy iron spade. The wooden handle was completely black with age, smooth from years of use, and covered in a thick layer of cobwebs. Jax reached out and pulled the tool free. The weight of the iron felt good in his hands. It felt solid. It felt real. He walked back to the center of the room and dropped to one knee beside the frantic dog. "Easy, Smoky," Jax commanded gently, placing a steadying hand on the German Shepherd's broad back. "Let me help you out. You're going to ruin those paws on these rocks." Smoky instantly ceased his digging, taking 2 obedient steps backward, though his amber eyes remained intensely locked on the shallow depression he had already carved into the floor. He let out a low, vibrating whine of anticipation, urging his handler to continue the work. Jax positioned the blade of the rusted spade against the hard-packed earth and drove it downward with a sharp, forceful thrust of his heavy boots. The soil in this specific section of the cellar was remarkably different from the rest of the floor. It was slightly looser, lacking the dense, impenetrable compaction of earth that had remained entirely undisturbed for a century. Someone had dug a massive hole here a very long time ago, filled it back in, and meticulously stamped it down to hide their work. Jax leveraged the wooden handle, breaking the earth loose and scooping heavy, damp clumps of dirt out of the depression. The physical labor was grueling, but to Jax, it was a profound, deeply necessary catharsis. With every agonizing thrust of the spade, with every heavy load of dirt he threw aside, he was physically purging the suffocating anxiety and the bitter despair that had threatened to completely consume him earlier that day. His muscles burned with a fierce, punishing fire, sweat completely soaking the collar of his shirt despite the freezing temperature of the cellar. He swung the heavy iron tool in a steady, methodical rhythm, burying the pain of his eviction, the agonizing sting of his son's rejection, and the haunting ghosts of the desert beneath the sheer, overwhelming effort of the physical task. He dug for nearly 40 minutes without stopping, carving a wide, rectangular trench directly into the center of the cellar floor. Smoky paced the perimeter of the hole, his tail held straight, occasionally leaning his massive head over the edge to sniff at the freshly exposed soil. Suddenly, the rusted iron blade of the spade struck something solid. It was not the dull, grinding scrape of iron hitting mountain rock. It was a sharp, hollow, incredibly resonant clank that echoed loudly off the granite walls of the basement. The sound sent a sudden, electric shockwave straight up the wooden handle and deep into Jax's shoulders. He froze immediately. His breathing was heavy and ragged, echoing loudly in the quiet space. Smoky let out a sharp, triumphant bark, his front paws dancing excitedly at the edge of the pit. Jax dropped the spade. He fell to both knees on the edge of the hole, leaning forward and reaching down into the damp earth with his bare hands. His calloused fingers scraped frantically against the dirt, clearing away the loose soil. The cold, unforgiving texture of heavy metal met his touch. He dug faster, his fingernails caked with dark mud, pushing the earth away until the flat, rectangular surface of a massive object was completely exposed. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed the powerful beam directly into the hole. Resting perfectly level in the damp earth, wrapped tightly in the decaying remnants of a heavy, waterproof canvas tarp, was a massive, military green footlocker. The paint was heavily chipped and scored by deep scratches, and the heavy iron latches were completely rusted shut, but the structural integrity of the steel box was entirely intact. Stenciled across the top lid in faded, yellow block letters was a name Jax recognized instantly. It was his grandfather's heavy deployment chest from the Vietnam War. Jax stared at the name painted on the steel, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. His grandmother Eleanor had kept this heavy chest locked away in the attic for as long as Jax could remember. He had never been allowed to touch it as a child. To find it buried deeply beneath the earth, completely hidden in a forgotten cellar, sent a cold, terrifying chill racing straight down his spine. She had not just hidden something, she had meticulously entombed it. "We have to get it out." "Smoky," Jax whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He reached down into the trench, wedging his thick fingers beneath the heavy steel carrying handles located on both sides of the footlocker. He braced his boots against the side of the hole, took a massive, chest-expanding breath, and pulled upward with every remaining ounce of physical strength in his battered body. The heavy chest groaned in protest, fighting against the suction of the damp earth that had held it captive for 3 decades. Jax gritted his teeth, a low, guttural growl escaping his throat as he forced his legs to straighten. With a loud, tearing sound of ripping canvas and shifting dirt, the massive steel footlocker broke free from its grave. Jax hauled it over the edge of the pit and let it drop heavily onto the cellar floor. The impact kicked up a massive cloud of gray dust that swirled wildly in the beam of the flashlight. Jax collapsed backward onto the ground, his chest heaving violently, his arms completely numb from the immense strain of the lift. Smoky immediately moved forward, sniffing aggressively along the rusted seams of the steel box, his tail wagging with a slow, focused intensity. It took Jax several minutes to regain enough strength to sit upright. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, positioning himself directly in front of the heavy steel chest. He reached out and touched the rusted metal latches. They were completely fused together by decades of subterranean moisture and heavy corrosion. He reached toward his canvas duffel bag and pulled out his heavy, military-grade utility knife. Using the thick, hardened steel pommel at the base of the handle, Jax began striking the rusted latches with heavy, calculated blows. The sharp, metallic clanging echoed deafeningly through the small, enclosed space. He struck the first latch again and again until the rusted locking mechanism finally shattered, breaking away in sharp, jagged flakes of orange metal. He moved immediately to the second latch, bringing the heavy steel pommel down with brutal force until it too surrendered and snapped completely open. Jax paused. He set the heavy knife down on the dirt floor. His hands were shaking violently, not from the physical exertion, but from the terrifying, overwhelming anticipation of what lay hidden beneath the heavy steel lid. He placed both hands firmly on the edges of the lid. Smoky stepped closer, sitting perfectly still directly beside him, watching the box with intense, unwavering focus. With a slow, agonizingly loud creak of grinding hinges, Jax pushed the heavy steel lid backward. The chest opened. A profound, incredibly distinct scent immediately drifted upward from the dark interior of the footlocker. It was not the smell of damp earth or decaying wood. It was the distinct, unmistakable scent of dry, aging paper mixed with the faint, sweet, and overwhelmingly familiar aroma of dried lavender. It was the exact scent of Eleanor Harlan's living room, perfectly preserved inside a steel time capsule for 30 long years. The scent hit Jax with the physical force of a heavy blow, instantly bringing a fresh wave of stinging tears to his tired gray eyes. Jax lifted the flashlight, directing the beam down into the chest. The interior was completely dry, perfectly protected from the elements by the heavy rubber gasket sealing the lid. Resting neatly at the bottom of the deep footlocker were dozens of thick, heavy manila folders, several bound leather ledger books, and neat, organized stacks of white envelopes, all meticulously tied together with thin, rough pieces of brown twine. Jax reached down slowly, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the smooth, dry paper. He gently lifted the very top envelope from the chest. The paper had yellowed significantly around the edges, entirely stiff with age. Written across the center of the envelope, in the elegant, looping, and unmistakably precise handwriting of his late grandmother was a single name, his name, to Jax. The ink seemed to leap off the aged paper, screaming into the quiet darkness of the cellar. He stared at the letters for a long time, unable to comprehend the reality of the moment. Eleanor had known he would be the one to open this chest. She had prepared this specific message solely for him, carefully orchestrating a conversation across the vast, impenetrable boundary of time and death. He carefully slid a calloused finger under the sealed flap of the envelope, tearing the brittle paper open with a soft, dry rasp. He pulled out a single, thick sheet of folded stationery. He unfolded the paper slowly, flattening the deep creases against his thigh. He angled the heavy flashlight to illuminate the dark ink, taking a deep, shuddering breath before he began to read the final words of the only person who had ever truly loved him without condition. "My dearest Jax," the letter began. The handwriting was remarkably steady, conveying a sense of profound, absolute resolve. "If you're reading these words, it means my greatest fear has come to pass. It means the lies they built have finally succeeded in tearing you away from the life you so deeply deserved. I always knew Silas Vance would not stop until he had taken everything from you, just as he took everything from the people he swore to protect." Jax stopped reading. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. Mayor Silas Vance, the most respected, untouchable political figure in Blackwood Ridge, the man who had publicly, sorrowfully accused Jax of stealing from the community, parading the false evidence before the entire city council. Jax's eyes raced down the page, devouring the neat, looping script in the beam of the light. "You never stole the Veteran Relief Fund, Jax," Eleanor had written, her words carrying the heavy, sharp weight of an absolute, undeniable truth. Silas Vance stole that money. He stole the millions of dollars meant to heal the broken soldiers of this valley, and he used it to build his own corrupt empire, buying up foreclosed properties, including the very land you're sitting on right now. He framed you because you were an easy target, a broken soldier the town was already afraid of. But I saw him, Jax. I saw what he did, and for the last 10 years of my life, I have quietly gathered the proof. Everything you need to destroy him, everything you need to take your life back, is in this box. Jax lowered the letter slowly, his hands dropping to rest heavily against his knees. The absolute silence of the subterranean cellar felt completely different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a forgotten tomb. It was the breathless, charged silence that immediately precedes a devastating explosion. For 30 years, Jax Harlan had lived his entire life apologizing for a crime he did not commit, carrying the crushing, suffocating weight of a town's absolute hatred on his battered shoulders. But as he looked down at the neatly stacked files, the hidden bank records, and the undeniable proof resting inside the rusted steel footlocker, the broken, defeated veteran slowly began to disappear. Smoky let out a low, deep rumble in his chest, sensing the massive, fundamental shift in the energy of the man sitting beside him. Jax looked up, staring into the dark, granite corner of the cellar, his pale gray eyes hardening into cold, unforgiving steel. He was no longer a victim. He was a Navy SEAL who had just been handed the exact coordinates of his enemy, Gemini Danoy. The beam of the heavy metallic flashlight cut through the dusty, stagnant air of the subterranean cellar, illuminating the absolute devastation of a perfectly orchestrated lie. Jax Harlan sat completely motionless on the freezing dirt floor, his broad shoulders squared, his calloused hands resting heavily upon the rusted edge of the military footlocker. The brittle, yellowed paper of his grandmother's letter still rested flat against his thigh, its profound revelation echoing violently through the hollow chambers of his mind. Mayor Silas Vance, the name tasted like ash in his mouth. For 3 agonizing decades, Jax had believed that his profound suffering was a natural consequence of a chaotic, uncaring universe. He had genuinely believed that he was fundamentally broken, cursed by the brutal horrors of his Navy SEAL deployments and entirely deserving of the horrific isolation that had been forced upon him by the town of Blackwood Ridge. But as the truth bled slowly from the ink on the page, the crushing weight of his misplaced guilt began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, searing wave of absolute clarity. Smoky sensed the massive, fundamental shift in the atmosphere of the room. The massive German Shepherd moved closer, abandoning his perimeter watch to sit directly beside his handler. The dog did not whine or nudge Jax for attention. Instead, Smoky simply leaned his heavy, warm shoulder against Jax's arm, offering his silent, unyielding strength as the veteran prepared to dive back into the darkest chapters of his own history. Jax reached out, his rough fingers burying themselves deeply into the thick, coarse fur behind the dog's ears, drawing an immeasurable amount of courage from the steady, rhythmic beating of the animal's heart. Jax took a slow, deep breath, expanding his lungs fully with the damp, heavy air of the cellar. He reached back down into the open chest, his hands moving with a new, deliberate precision. The trembling fear and the paralyzing anxiety had completely vanished. He bypassed a stack of faded photographs and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger book. The cover was worn smooth from years of constant handling, the binding cracked and fraying at the edges. Jax opened the ledger, laying it flat across his knees, and aimed the bright beam of the flashlight directly onto the pages. The interior of the book was a masterpiece of meticulous, undeniable accounting. Eleanor Harlan had not simply written down rumors or whispered suspicions. She had engaged in a systematic, forensic deconstruction of Silas Vance's entire financial empire. Column after column of carefully recorded numbers, dates, and corresponding bank routing codes filled the lined pages. Jax traced his thick finger along the faded blue lines, his eyes narrowing as he followed the money trail. Eleanor had specifically tracked the Blackwood Ridge Veteran Relief Fund, a massive, multi-million-dollar civic account established 30 years ago to provide housing, medical care, and financial stability to the young men returning from the brutal conflicts overseas. It was money meant to heal the broken, to rebuild shattered lives, and to honor the ultimate sacrifices made by soldiers who had bled for their country. But according to the immaculate records spread across Jax's lap, that money had never reached a single veteran. Jax turned the heavy pages, his jaw setting into a rigid, unforgiving line. He watched the numbers move. Month after month, year after year, massive sums of money were systematically drained from the central relief account. But they were not recorded as standard withdrawals. They were meticulously disguised as administrative fees, consulting retainers, and anonymous municipal grants, slowly funneled outward through a complex, twisting labyrinth of dummy corporations and empty shell companies. And at the absolute center of this intricate web of deceit, authorizing every single fraudulent transaction with his bold, sweeping signature, was Mayor Silas Vance. The sheer, monumental scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to comprehend. Vance had not simply stolen from the town, he had stolen from the most vulnerable, deeply wounded members of his own community. He had robbed men who were already fighting for their lives against the invisible demons of war. Men who had returned home desperately needing the very resources Vance was quietly siphoning into his own private accounts. Jax reached deeper into the chest and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. The name Helen Croft was written across the front in hurried, nervous handwriting. Jax recognized the name instantly. Helen had been the head town clerk of Blackwood Ridge 30 years ago, a quiet, deeply observant woman who essentially managed the vast bureaucracy of the entire municipal government. She had vanished completely from the valley, mere weeks after the terrible scandal that had destroyed Jax's life, an event the town simply wrote off as a sudden, unexpected relocation. Jax tore the envelope open, pulling out several thick pages of official municipal stationery. The letter was dated exactly 3 days before the day Jax had been publicly accused of theft. Eleanor, the letter began, the handwriting erratic and rushed, conveying a profound, suffocating sense of sheer terror. If you're reading this, it means I did not make it out of the valley, or it means Silas finally realized how much I truly know. I have been watching the municipal accounts for the last 2 years. The Veteran Relief Fund is completely empty. Silas has been routing the money into a series of offshore holding companies, and he is using those stolen funds to anonymously purchase hundreds of acres of foreclosed residential and commercial properties throughout the county. He is literally using the town's own stolen money to buy the town out from under its own citizens. Jax stopped reading for a moment, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The magnitude of the corruption was staggering. Vance was not just a thief, he was a predator, systematically devouring the valley while wearing the trusted, benevolent mask of a devoted public servant. Jax returned his focus to the letter, his eyes sweeping rapidly across the terrifying confession. I tried to confront him. Eleanor, Helen had written. The ink smeared slightly near the bottom of the page, as if by a fallen tear. I walked into his office after hours and placed the transfer logs directly on his desk. I thought he would deny it. I thought he would panic. But he did not. He just smiled at me, Eleanor. It was the coldest, most terrifying smile I have ever seen. He told me that if I ever spoke a single word about the funds, I would simply disappear in the mountains and no one would ever look for me. But worse than that, he told me his backup plan. The town auditors are arriving next week, and they are going to notice the massive discrepancies in the municipal balance sheets. Silas told me he needs a scapegoat, someone the town is already terrified of, someone they will easily believe is capable of chaotic, desperate actions. Jax felt the air in his lungs turn to solid ice. He knew exactly what the next sentence was going to say before he even read it. He is going to blame your grandson. Eleanor, Helen's letter concluded. He is going to blame Jax. He knows Jax just returned from his deployment. He knows Jax is suffering from severe combat trauma, that he is having public episodes, that the town is already whispering about how unstable the young veteran has become. Silas has fabricated a paper trail pointing directly to Jax, making it look as though Jax stole a small fraction of the money to feed a hidden addiction, using that fabricated theft to completely camouflage the missing millions. I am so deeply sorry, Eleanor. I'm leaving tonight. I have enclosed the original, unaltered bank routing numbers proving Silas authorized the true transfers. Please, protect your boy. The letter ended there. Jax slowly lowered the pages to his lap. The profound, overwhelming silence of the cellar pressed heavily against his ears. He closed his eyes, and the memories of that terrible, life-altering day came rushing back. Completely unfiltered, stripped of the confusion and the desperate self-doubt that had clouded his mind for 30 years. He remembered standing in the center of the town square, surrounded by hundreds of angry, betrayed citizens. He remembered the blinding flash of the local newspaper cameras. But most vividly, he remembered the face of Mayor Silas Vance. Vance had stood on the wooden steps of the town hall, looking down at the young, traumatized Navy SEAL with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. Vance had spoken to the crowd with a soft, forgiving tone, mourning the tragic fall of a local hero, publicly lamenting how the horrors of war had twisted a good boy into a desperate, thieving criminal. Vance had offered him mercy instead of prison, banishing him to the edges of society, permanently destroying Jax's reputation, his military career, and his future, all while standing securely on a mountain of stolen millions. And the town had believed every single word. They had chosen to believe the polished, smiling politician over the broken, bleeding soldier who had fought for their freedom. Even Mateo, his own flesh and blood, had eventually succumbed to the overwhelming pressure of the lie. Looking at his father with eyes filled with profound shame and deep resentment, a low, vibrating growl snapped Jax out of the devastating memory. Smoky was standing up, his massive body positioned directly between Jax and the heavy iron cellar doors. The dog's amber eyes were fixed upward toward the ceiling, his ears flattened slightly against his skull, Sensing the massive surge of adrenaline and raw, unfiltered anger flooding into the confined space, Jax opened his eyes. They were no longer the pale, defeated gray of a man waiting quietly for the end. They were the color of cold, forged steel, sharp and terrifyingly focused. He was not broken. He had never been broken. He had been targeted. He had been ambushed by a coward who fought with lies and forged signatures instead of rifles and courage. But Silas Vance had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. He had left his enemy alive. Jax reached down and grabbed the faded green canvas duffel bag lying on the dirt floor. He unzipped the heavy brass teeth and began systematically packing the contents of the rusted steel footlocker. He moved with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a soldier breaking down an operating base and preparing for a major offensive. He packed the thick leather ledgers, the bundles of bank transfer records, the faded photographs of the shell companies, and the terrifying, damning confession of Helen Croft. He placed Eleanor's final letter safely inside the waterproof interior pocket, close to his heart. He packed every single piece of undeniable, weaponized truth into the heavy bag, ensuring nothing was left behind in the damp, freezing dirt. He zipped the bag completely shut and hoisted it over his broad shoulder. The heavy canvas strap bit sharply into his collarbone, but he did not feel the pain. He did not feel the throbbing ache in his battered knees, nor the exhaustion that had plagued him only an hour ago. The agonizing, suffocating fog of trauma and despair had been completely burned away by the righteous, purifying fire of an absolute mission. He looked down at the massive German Shepherd standing faithfully by his side. Smoky was looking back at him, his tail perfectly still, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous anticipation. The dog knew they were no longer hiding. They were preparing to march. The storm 30 years ago took everything from us. Buddy, Jax said, his gravelly voice echoing with a low, powerful resonance off the solid granite walls. It is finally time we bring the storm back to them. Jax grabbed the heavy metallic flashlight and turned toward the narrow stone staircase leading up to the heavy iron doors. The rain had completely stopped. The night above was waiting. The long, terrifying exile of Jax Harlan was officially over. He was returning to Blackwood Ridge, and he was bringing the absolute, undeniable truth with him. The heavy iron doors of the cellar groaned in loud, protesting agony as Jax pushed them upward, breaking the dark, subterranean seal and opening the forgotten tomb to the sky. A brilliant, piercing ray of morning sunlight instantly flooded the damp stone stairwell, striking the cold granite walls and illuminating the thousands of swirling dust motes that danced in the heavy air. The violent, chaotic mountain storm that had raged through the night had washed the Colorado wilderness completely clean, stripping the thick, oppressive dust of decades from the towering pines and leaving the high-altitude air tasting sharply of frozen pine resin, wet earth, and raw, electric ozone. It was a morning that felt entirely brand new, a pristine, untouched canvas that stood in stark, blinding contrast to the dark, buried history Jax now carried upon his shoulders. Smoky bounded up the narrow stone steps ahead of him, emerging into the crisp, freezing mountain air with a powerful, full-body shake that sent a magnificent spray of rainwater flying from his thick, dark coat. The massive German Shepherd lifted his head high, his sharp amber eyes scanning the perimeter of the ruined foundation, his ears swiveling to catch the distant, morning calls of the forest birds. He looked back down the stairwell, letting out a short, encouraging bark. Jax climbed out of the cellar slowly, his heavy leather boots finding solid purchase on the frost-covered stones of his grandmother's ruined estate. He did not carry the rusted steel footlocker itself. The metal box was far too heavy, too completely consumed by the unforgiving corrosion of 30 years beneath the earth, to survive the treacherous mountain descent. Instead, the thick, faded green canvas duffel bag slung securely across his broad, aching back contained its entire, devastating soul. The leather-bound ledgers, the bundles of altered bank transfers, the hidden property deeds, and the terrifying, damning confession of Helen Croft were all packed tightly against his spine, a heavy, physical weight that served to anchor his mind entirely in the present reality. He stood for a long moment amidst the charred, overgrown ruins of Eleanor Harlan's home, looking out across the vast, sweeping expanse of the valley below. He took a deep chest, expanding breath, filling his lungs with the freezing, immaculate air. He was battered. His joints throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, his hands were cut and heavily bruised from tearing at the frozen earth, and his face was lined with the profound exhaustion of a man who had not truly slept in decades. Yet as he adjusted the heavy canvas strap across his chest, Jax Harlan had never felt stronger. The suffocating, paralyzing fog of misplaced guilt and combat trauma that had clouded his mind for 30 years had been entirely burned away by the righteous, purifying fire of an absolute mission. He was a Navy SEAL, and he had finally found his true enemy. "Let us go, Smoky," Jax commanded, his gravelly voice echoing with a low, powerful resonance through the quiet clearing. It is time to go back to town. The hike down the mountain was a brutal, punishing test of physical endurance, but Jax no longer felt the agonizing, sharp pain in his shattered knees. He moved with a relentless, driving momentum, his boots crushing through the frozen underbrush, guided by an unwavering, singular focus. Smoky maintained a perfect, disciplined position at his left side, matching his handler's aggressive pace, an imposing, wolf-like guardian moving silently through the shadows of the ancient pines. It took them nearly 4 hours of relentless, demanding hiking to finally reach the crumbling asphalt edge of the county highway. Along the way, they passed the rusted, silent shell of Jax's dead pickup truck, still sitting exactly where its engine had violently choked and died the day before. Only 24 hours had passed since the bank officials had stood in his driveway and driven him from his family land, yet to Jax, it felt as though he had aged another lifetime, crossing a vast, invisible ocean of time and emerging entirely reborn on the opposite shore. He barely glanced at the abandoned vehicle as they marched past it, leaving the rusted metal behind in the dirt, just as he was preparing to leave his life as a victim behind forever. As they approached the outer, manicured limits of Blackwood Ridge, a strange, completely unnatural sound began to drift up through the quiet valley, entirely out of place in the rugged, stoic silence of the Colorado mountains. It was the faint, tinny, rhythmic echo of a high school marching band, immediately followed by the deep, booming resonance of a magnified voice carrying over large, public address speakers. Jax slowed his pace slightly, his pale gray eyes narrowing as he looked down the long, sweeping curve of the main road. Today was not just an ordinary, quiet Sunday in Blackwood Ridge. Today was the highly anticipated, lavishly funded dedication ceremony of the brand new, multi-million-dollar Blackwood Ridge Town Hall and Civic Center. From his elevated vantage point on the highway, Jax could see the massive gleaming structure sitting proudly at the center of the town square. It was a towering monument of polished white marble, imported glass, and rich dark mahogany, a building that looked entirely too extravagant for a humble mountain community. For years, the townspeople had marveled at Mayor Vance's incredible ability to secure the massive, anonymous municipal grants required to fund such a spectacular project, but as Jax stared at the gleaming white columns, his stomach turned with a cold, absolute disgust. He now possessed the terrifying ability to see completely through the polished, manicured facade. He knew exactly how that building had been paid for. Every single marble brick, every pane of imported glass, and every perfectly manicured blade of grass in the surrounding square had been purchased with the stolen blood and shattered futures of the Blackwood Ridge Veteran Relief Fund. Jax stepped off the gravel shoulder of the highway and onto the smooth, perfectly paved surface of Main Street. The town square was absolutely packed. Hundreds of white folding chairs were arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows across the freshly cut, emerald green grass, filled with the citizens of Blackwood Ridge dressed in their finest, most respectable Sunday attire. Bright, patriotic bunting in bold, unapologetic shades of crimson, pristine white, and deep navy blue draped elegantly across the gleaming marble columns of the newly constructed building. Massive bouquets of expensive flowers lined the elevated wooden stage, where the entire city council sat in a row of high-backed leather chairs, looking down upon the crowd with expressions of profound, manufactured civic pride, and standing directly behind a heavy, polished oak podium at the absolute center of the stage, completely bathed in the warm, golden light of the morning sun, was Mayor Silas Vance. Vance's magnified voice boomed across the square, rich, smooth, and dripping with practiced political sincerity. I stand before you today not just as your mayor, but as a humble, devoted servant of this incredible, deeply resilient community, Vance proclaimed, his hands resting confidently on the edges of the podium. This magnificent building is not just a structure of stone and glass. It is a symbol of our shared prosperity, a testament to what we can achieve when we stand together, united in our commitment to the future of Blackwood Ridge. A wave of enthusiastic applause erupted from the seated crowd, echoing loudly off the surrounding brick storefronts. Jax did not stop walking. He stepped past the barricades and entered the rear of the town square. The transition from a quiet, festive murmur to a stunned, absolute silence rippled through the outer edges of the massive crowd like a heavy stone dropped into a perfectly still, glass-like pond. It happened slowly at first. A woman standing near the back row happened to glance over her shoulder, her polite applause dying instantly in her throat as her eyes widened in profound shock. She nudged her husband, who turned, his jaw dropping slightly. Within seconds, the terrible, uncomfortable silence began spreading aggressively forward, row by row, as more and more people turned their heads to look at the massive, imposing figure, walking methodically down the center grassy aisle. Jax Harlan looked entirely out of place in the sea of tailored suits and floral dresses. He wore a faded, dirt-stained canvas jacket, his heavy leather boots caked with the dark, wet mud of the mountain ruins. His broad shoulders carried the massive, bulging duffel bag, and his weathered face was set into a terrifying mask of cold, unforgiving stone. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a battle-hardened soldier marching directly into an active combat zone, and walking perfectly in step beside him, moving with the terrifying, predatory grace of a wild wolf, was Smoky. The massive German Shepherd did not bark, nor did he pull against an invisible leash. He walked freely at Jax's side, his massive head held high, his sharp amber eyes scanning the sea of unfamiliar, whispering faces with a cold, highly protective intelligence. The dog's deep, muscular chest vibrated with a low, almost imperceptible warning rumble, a silent declaration that anyone who attempted to touch the man beside him would face immediate, devastating consequences. What is he doing here? A voice whispered loudly from the third row. Is that Jax Harlan? Another muttered, the tone thick with a mixture of disbelief and ingrained disgust. He was evicted yesterday. He is supposed to be gone. Somebody call Sheriff Brody. A man in a dark suit hissed nervously, instinctively pulling his young daughter closer to his side as the massive dog walked past. Jax did not look at any of them. He did not offer the townspeople his anger, nor did he seek their sudden pity or understanding. They were entirely irrelevant to the mission at hand. His pale gray eyes were locked entirely on the elevated stage at the far end of the square, staring directly through the crowd with the terrifying, absolute focus of a sniper finding his target in the crosshairs. On the stage, Mayor Silas Vance paused in the middle of a grand, sweeping sentence. The sudden, suffocating silence of the crowd had finally reached the podium. Vance frowned slightly, a flash of genuine annoyance crossing his polished features as he looked up from his prepared speech, trying to locate the source of the interruption. His eyes scanned the center aisle, moving past the rows of seated citizens until they finally landed on the tall, scarred veteran and the massive German Shepherd marching deliberately toward the stage. For a fraction of a second, a shadow of absolute, paralyzing terror flickered deeply within the mayor's dark eyes. The confident, benevolent smile vanished instantly, replaced by the tight, pale mask of a man who suddenly realized that the ghost he had buried 30 years ago had just clawed its way out of the grave. Jax stopped walking when he reached the absolute center of the front row, standing exactly 10 feet away from the base of the elevated stage. The silence in the square was now absolute, so profound and heavy that the faint rustling of the patriotic bunting in the wind sounded like distant thunder. Hundreds of eyes were locked onto the disgraced veteran, waiting with breathless, terrified anticipation for the explosion they all sensed was coming. Jax stood perfectly still. Smoky sat instantly by his left leg, an imposing monument of loyalty and raw power. Jax reached up slowly, his calloused hands gripping the thick canvas strap of the duffel bag, his eyes completely locked with the terrified gaze of Mayor Silas Vance. The silence that blanketed the town square of Blackwood Ridge was not the respectful, expectant quiet of a civic ceremony. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a lit fuse rapidly burning toward a powder keg. Hundreds of citizens sat frozen in their white folding chairs, their eyes darting nervously between the towering, mud-stained figure of Jax Harlan and the suddenly pale, rigid posture of Mayor Silas Vance standing behind the mahogany podium. The only sound in the entire square was the gentle, rhythmic rustling of the patriotic bunting in the cold mountain breeze and the low, steady panting of the massive German Shepherd sitting at Jax's side. Sheriff Brody, a large, heavy-set man with a thick gray mustache and a shiny silver star pinned to his pressed uniform, stepped out from the shadows near the edge of the stage. He rested his right hand casually on the heavy leather grip of his sidearm, taking 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the center aisle. "Jax," Sheriff Brody said, his voice deep and carrying a firm, practiced authority that echoed across the quiet grass. "You need to turn around and walk away. You have no business being here today. Your property was transferred to the bank yesterday morning. If you do not leave this square immediately, I will be forced to arrest you for public disturbance." Jax did not even turn his head to look at the sheriff. His pale, forged steel eyes remained entirely locked on Mayor Vance. "I am not leaving," Jax replied, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence with the cold, absolute certainty of a man who had entirely stopped caring about the consequences. "And I am not here about my house." Mayor Vance cleared his throat, desperately attempting to summon the smooth, commanding political persona that had successfully controlled this town for 3 decades. He gripped the edges of the heavy oak podium so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. "Jax, please," Vance said, projecting his voice through the microphone, ensuring the entire town could hear his manufactured, deeply patronizing tone of sorrow. "We all know you have struggled deeply since your deployments. We know the war took a terrible toll on your mind. This town has tried to offer you grace, despite the terrible choices you made 30 years ago. But this behavior is simply unacceptable. Please, let Sheriff Brody escort you to a hospital where you can finally get the psychological help you so desperately need." A murmur of nervous agreement rippled through the seated crowd. Several people nodded, looking at Jax with expressions of deep pity mixed with fear. Vance was employing the exact same tactic he had used 30 years ago, masterfully using Jax's genuine combat trauma as a weapon to completely discredit him in front of the entire community. But Jax did not flinch. The suffocating anxiety and the paralyzing self-doubt that Vance had relied upon were completely gone, burned away by the truth hidden inside the heavy bag. "You are very good at that, Silas," Jax said softly, yet his voice carried an incredible, terrifying weight. He reached his right hand over his broad shoulder, gripping the heavy brass zipper of the canvas duffel bag. "You are very good at making people believe the lie." With a single, violent motion, Jax unzipped the bag and reached inside. Sheriff Brody instantly unsnapped the leather retention strap on his holster. Hands where I can see them. Jax. Right now. Smoky stood up instantly. The massive dog stepped directly in front of Jax, placing his large body entirely between his handler and the sheriff. The German Shepherd's ears flattened completely against his skull, his lips curling back to expose a terrifying array of sharp, white teeth. A deep, vibrating snarl erupted from the dog's chest, a sound so primal and aggressive that Sheriff Brody instinctively took a half-step backward, his hand freezing on the grip of his weapon. Easy. Smoky, Jax commanded softly, placing a calming hand on the dog's broad back. Smoky instantly ceased snarling, but he did not sit down. He remained standing, a lethal, coiled spring, his amber eyes locked entirely on the sheriff. Jax pulled a thick, heavy bundle of yellowed papers from the duffel bag. It was the leather-bound ledger book and the stacks of altered bank transfer records his grandmother had painstakingly hidden. He did not wave them wildly in the air. He held them firmly in his calloused hands, raising them just high enough for the mayor to see exactly what they were. Silas Vance's face turned the color of old ash. He recognized the heavy leather ledger instantly. The manufactured mask of the benevolent politician completely shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered coward hiding beneath. 30 years ago, Jax began, his voice rising slightly in volume, carrying clearly across the silent, shocked crowd. This town stood in this exact same square, and you told them that I stole millions of dollars from the Blackwood Ridge Veteran Relief Fund. You told them I was a broken, desperate addict who stole the money meant to heal my own brothers in arms. Sheriff, remove him, Vance shouted into the microphone, his voice suddenly shrill and completely panicked. Remove him right now. He is unstable, but Sheriff Brody did not move. He was a career lawman, and he had noticed the absolute terror that had suddenly consumed the mayor. He looked at the thick stack of aged documents in Jax's hand, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. The money was never stolen, Jax continued, his voice echoing like thunder off the gleaming marble walls of the new town hall. It was systematically transferred out of the municipal accounts through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. And I did not authorize a single one of those transfers. Jax took a slow, deliberate step toward the stage. Smoky moved perfectly in sync beside him. This ledger, Jax said, holding up the heavy leather book, contains the original, unaltered bank routing numbers. And this envelope contains the written confession of Helen Croft, the town clerk who disappeared 30 years ago after she discovered exactly what was happening to the municipal accounts. A loud, collective gasp erupted from the center of the crowd. The name Helen Croft struck the older citizens like a physical blow. "Stop talking!" Vance screamed, abandoning the podium completely and pointing a trembling finger at Jax. "Those are forgeries. He is a liar and a thief. He is trying to destroy everything we have built. The money you stole." "Silas," Jax roared, his voice finally breaking free from its quiet constraint, vibrating with 30 years of repressed, righteous fury. "You used it to quietly purchase hundreds of acres of foreclosed properties across this county. You used the blood money of wounded soldiers to build your own private empire. And you used it to build this extravagant monument to yourself." Jax pointed a heavy, calloused finger directly at the towering white columns of the new town hall. Complete, chaotic pandemonium broke out in the square. Hundreds of citizens began shouting at once. People were standing up, knocking over their white folding chairs. Reporters from the local paper who were covering the dedication ceremony began aggressively pushing their way toward the front, cameras flashing rapidly. A man in a dark suit, one of Mayor Vance's closest political aides, suddenly lunged forward from the front row, attempting to snatch the documents directly out of Jax's hand. He never even made it close. Smoky exploded into motion. The massive German Shepherd launched himself through the air with terrifying, incredible speed, striking the man squarely in the chest with all 90 pounds of his muscular body. The aide was thrown violently backward, crashing heavily into a row of folding chairs. Smoky landed squarely on top of the man's chest, his massive jaws snapping shut mere inches from the aide's terrified face, a deafening, terrifying roar vibrating from the dog's throat. Screams erupted from the crowd. "Smoky, heel!" Jax commanded sharply. The dog instantly stopped snarling. He stepped off the terrified man's chest and returned immediately to Jax's side, sitting down and sweeping his sharp amber eyes across the crowd, challenging anyone else to make a move. Sheriff Brody had his sidearm drawn now, but it was not pointed at Jax or the dog. The sheriff's face was dark, his jaw set in a rigid line. He walked slowly up the wooden steps of the stage, bypassing Jax entirely, and walked directly toward Mayor Silas Vance. "Sheriff," Vance stammered, backing away until his shoulders hit the mahogany podium. "You cannot possibly believe this madman. You have known me for 20 years. Arrest him." Sheriff Brody stopped 3 feet away from the mayor. He looked down at the pale, sweating politician, and then he looked back over his shoulder at the tall, battered veteran standing quietly on the grass with the thick stack of documents in his hand. "Jax," Sheriff Brody called out, his deep voice cutting through the chaotic shouting of the crowd. "Are you willing to hand those documents over to the State Bureau of Investigation right now?" Jax nodded once, his expression completely stone. "I am, and I have more in the bag." Sheriff Brody turned back to Mayor Vance. He slowly, deliberately slid his sidearm back into its heavy leather holster, snapping the retention strap shut. He reached to the back of his duty belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Silas Vance," the sheriff said, his voice cold and completely devoid of emotion. "I think you and I need to take a long, quiet ride down to the station. We have 30 years of paperwork to catch up on." The mayor's legs completely gave out. He collapsed into the high-backed leather chair behind the podium, burying his face in his trembling hands as the deafening, chaotic roar of a betrayed town washed over him. Jax stood quietly in the center of the frantic square. The suffocating weight he had carried for 3 decades was gone, completely lifted from his shoulders. He reached down, burying his rough hand into the thick fur of the loyal German Shepherd sitting proudly at his side. The war was finally over. 1 year later, the rugged, towering peaks surrounding Blackwood Ridge remained exactly as they had always been. Vast and silent monuments of gray stone, carving sharp, jagged lines into the endless Colorado sky. The heavy winter snows had melted away, surrendering the high mountain passes to the vibrant, breathtaking bloom of late spring. The biting, bitter winds that had once howled so mournfully through the pine forests had softened into a gentle, fragrant breeze, carrying the sweet scent of wild columbines and sun-warmed earth down into the valley. The town of Blackwood Ridge had survived the devastating earthquake of the Truth, and like a forest slowly regenerating after a massive, purifying fire, it was finally beginning to heal. But nowhere was that profound, beautiful transformation more evident than on the secluded, elevated ridge where Eleanor Harlan's estate had once burned to the ground. The charred, blackened foundation stones and the aggressive, thorny vines were completely gone. In their place stood a beautiful, meticulously constructed log cabin, built strong and square from heavy, aromatic cedar. It was not a massive, sprawling mansion, but it was a home built with absolute intention, designed to withstand the harshest storms and to capture the brilliant, golden light of the setting sun. A wide, sweeping wooden porch wrapped completely around the front of the cabin, overlooking the magnificent, bowl-shaped valley below. Heavy cast-iron wind chimes hung from the sturdy cedar rafters, singing a low, melodic, and deeply comforting song whenever the mountain breeze brushed past. Jax Harlan sat quietly in a heavy, hand-carved wooden rocking chair on the porch, a steaming mug of black coffee resting comfortably in his calloused hand. The physical transformation of the former Navy SEAL was nothing short of miraculous. The crushing, invisible weight that had brutally hunched his broad shoulders for 3 agonizing decades had been completely lifted. He sat tall, his posture relaxed and open to the world. The deep, dark circles of exhaustion beneath his eyes had completely vanished, and the pale, storm-swept gray of his irises now held a quiet, profound, and unshakable peace. The harsh lines of trauma carved into his weathered face had softened, replaced by the gentle, natural creases of a man who had finally remembered how to smile. Stretched out luxuriously across the warm, sun-baked wooden floorboards beside the rocking chair was Smoky. The massive German Shepherd looked incredibly majestic in the late afternoon light, his thick, dark sable coat gleaming with supreme health. Smoky rested his heavy chin flat against his large front paws, his eyes half closed in deep, absolute contentment, though his large ears occasionally swiveled to track the rustling flight of a mountain bluebird landing in a nearby pine tree. The invisible, highly charged tension that had once radiated from the dog, the constant, protective vigilance required to keep a broken man from entirely falling apart, was completely gone. Smoky no longer had to be a full-time shield against a hostile world. He was finally allowed to simply be a dog, resting peacefully beside the master he had saved. Jax leaned forward slightly, reaching down to run his rough, scarred fingers slowly through the thick fur along Smoky's spine. The German Shepherd let out a long, dramatic sigh of pure comfort, leaning his heavy body weight into the familiar, loving touch. "You earned this rest, buddy," Jax murmured, his gravelly voice incredibly soft, carrying only warmth and deep affection. "You earned every single second of it." The aftermath of that chaotic, explosive morning in the town square had been swift, devastating, and entirely undeniable. Armed with the meticulous, ironclad evidence preserved inside the rusted military footlocker, state and federal investigators had descended upon Blackwood Ridge like an unstoppable avalanche. Mayor Silas Vance's vast, corrupt empire had collapsed within a matter of days. The massive web of offshore shell companies was completely dismantled, and the stolen millions from the Veteran Relief Fund were systematically recovered and returned to their rightful, sacred purpose. Vance was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, facing a sentence that guaranteed he would never walk as a free man again. But more importantly than the justice delivered to the corrupt politician was the absolute, public redemption of Jax Harlan. The town council of Blackwood Ridge had issued a formal, deeply apologetic public declaration, completely clearing his name and officially restoring his honor. The United States Navy, upon reviewing the suppressed truth of his wrongful civilian disgrace, had quietly stepped in to restore his full military pension and commendations. The settlement funds recovered from Vance's illegal land seizures had allowed Jax to purchase his grandmother's land back free and clear, and to build the sturdy, peaceful cabin he now called home. The crunch of heavy tires rolling slowly over the gravel driveway broke the quiet serenity of the afternoon. Jax did not tense. Smoky did not leap to his feet with a warning growl. They both simply turned their heads toward the sound, watching as a dark, familiar SUV parked neatly near the edge of the property. The driver's side door opened, and Mayor Harlan stepped out into the mountain sunshine. He looked up at the cabin, offering a small, slightly hesitant, but incredibly genuine smile. Mateo walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle and opened the rear door, unbuckling a small, bright-eyed 6-year-old girl with a head of wild, curly brown hair. Maya, Jax's granddaughter, hit the gravel driveway running, her small legs carrying her as fast as she could manage directly toward the wooden porch. "Grandpa!" Maya shrieked, her voice echoing with pure, unfiltered joy. Jax set his coffee mug down on the small wooden table beside his chair and stood up, dropping heavily to one knee just as the little girl launched herself up the porch steps and completely into his open arms. He caught her effortlessly, wrapping his massive, powerful arms carefully around her small frame, burying his face in her curly hair. He closed his eyes, inhaling the sweet, innocent scent of strawberry shampoo and sunshine. This single, beautiful moment This profound, unbroken connection with his own blood was worth every single agonizing second of the hell he had endured to reach it. "I missed you, little bird," Jax whispered, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "I missed you too, Grandpa," Maya declared loudly, pulling back to look at him. She immediately dropped her gaze to the floorboards. "And I missed Smoky." The massive German Shepherd had sat up, his tail sweeping back and forth across the wood in a slow, welcoming rhythm. Maya dropped to her knees right beside the towering dog. Smoky, despite his incredible size and terrifying power, instantly transformed into a remarkably gentle, incredibly patient creature. He lowered his massive head, allowing the tiny girl to wrap her arms around his thick neck, closing his amber eyes as she pressed her small cheek against his nose. Mateo walked slowly up the wooden stairs, his hands tucked comfortably into the pockets of his jacket. The bitter, exhausted anger that had clouded his eyes a year ago, on the terrible morning of the eviction, had been entirely replaced by a profound, humbling respect. The journey to rebuild their fractured relationship had been slow, paved with long, quiet conversations and deeply necessary apologies. But the foundation they were building now was infinitely stronger than it had ever been before. "It is beautiful up here today, Dad," Mateo said quietly. Looking out across the vast expanse of the valley, Jax stood up, placing a heavy, warm hand squarely on his son's shoulder. "It always was, Mateo. We just finally have the eyes to see it again." Mateo smiled, looking down at his daughter giggling as Smoky gently licked her hand. "She has been talking about coming up to see the dog all week. I think she loves him more than she loves me." Jax let out a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed pleasantly across the porch. "Well, he is a very easy dog to love. He is the best of us." They stood together on the porch for a long time, watching the sun begin its slow, majestic descent behind the jagged peaks of the western ridge. The sky ignited in breathtaking, fiery shades of crushed violet, deep crimson, and brilliant gold, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lush green valley floor. As Jax watched his granddaughter laugh, completely safe and entirely protected in the presence of the massive, loyal animal, he found himself thinking about the dark, freezing cellar beneath the earth. He thought about the terrible, suffocating weight of the lie he had carried, and the incredible, unmatched courage it took to finally dig it up. The truth, Jax realized, was very much like a seed buried deep beneath the cold, unforgiving dirt. It can be hidden in the absolute darkness for decades. It can be ignored, denied, and walked over by people who refuse to acknowledge it as there. But the truth never truly dies. It simply waits. It waits for the right season, for the right storm to wash away the layers of deception. And sometimes, it simply waits for the right, fiercely loyal companion to start digging. If it had not been for the dog sitting on the porch, Jax knew he would have died a forgotten, broken man in the wilderness. Smoky had not just found a rusted steel box in the dirt. The German Shepherd had reached into the absolute darkest, most terrifying depths of Jax's shattered soul and pulled him back into the light. Smoky had given him the courage to stand tall, the strength to fight back, and the profound, beautiful opportunity to finally live the life he had always deserved. Jax stepped forward, lowering himself into the heavy wooden rocking chair once more. Smoky immediately left Maya's side and trotted over to Jax, resting his large, heavy head gently upon the veteran's knee. Jax smiled, resting his hand firmly on the dog's head, watching the beautiful, brilliant sunset with his family gathered safely around him. The long, brutal war was finally, truly over, and the peace that followed was more beautiful than he could have ever possibly imagined. If this deeply emotional story of Jax and Smoky touched your heart today, I would love to hear from you down in the comments. Sometimes the smallest, simplest comment can truly mean the absolute most to our community. So if you're still here, sitting quietly on the porch with Jax and his loyal dog at the very end of this incredible journey, please type the number 1 in the comments below. It is a very simple way to let us know that you were here, standing with them through the darkest storms. And if you truly believe in your heart that a fiercely loyal dog possesses the incredible power to completely change a human life, type the number 0. I read the comments every single day, and seeing those numbers reminds me that these stories of redemption and absolute loyalty truly matter to wonderful people out there just like you. Also, please tell me where you are watching from today. Blackwood Ridge may just be a small, quiet place in this particular story, but our incredible, supportive community here is spread all across the entire world. And I love seeing where every single one of you is joining us from. And if you deeply enjoy sweeping, cinematic stories about unyielding courage, absolute loyalty, and the quiet, humble heroes who absolutely refuse to ever give up the fight, please make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because the very next story is already waiting to be told. There is another brave veteran, another incredibly loyal dog, and another deeply powerful truth that simply hasn't been discovered yet. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.